It's time to talk about a fundamental, foundational aspect of Node.js that's so important that a good portion of the core JavaScript modules in Node.js are built on top of it. Let's talk about events and the event emitter. And for our first lecture, a conceptual aside. What do we mean when we're talking about events in Node.js? Well, for starters, big word alert, an event. It's something that has happened in our app that we can respond to. And the idea of events isn't limited to Node.js. The concept of events and listening to or responding to events is in many areas of software architecture and on many platforms. But basically, we're talking about this idea that responding to an action, an event, responding to something that has happened. The confusing part, though, for many, even those that have used Node.js for a while, is that in Node, we actually talk about two different kinds of events. However, we have a tendency to think about those two kinds of events as if they were just one kind of event. We say the term event, and we think we're talking about something in general. But they're actually two separate things, two separate kinds of events. However, they're often connected or tied into each other, but they don't have to be. All right, what are we talking about? Well, on one side, in Node.js, you're dealing with system events. And that comes from the C++ side of the Node.js core, thanks to a library called libuv, which we've seen before and we'll see later. But that's the C++ code, a library of C++ code that's part of Node.js that deals with events coming from the computer system, like, I finished reading a file. The file is open. I've received data from the internet, and other things like that. Things that JavaScript doesn't have. And those C++ events then allow us to respond to those things happening with code. On the other side, we have custom events in Node.js, which are completely different. They're inside the JavaScript core. It's a JavaScript library of events that deals with events that I can create for myself, where I can in my code say, hey, this happened, and have code that responds to something happening. However, this is not part of the C++ core libuv. This is the event emitter inside the JavaScript core. It's a JavaScript file that contains the code for what's called the event emitter. So the event emitter in Node is where we have custom events, and that's JavaScript. And libuv, which you never really see when you're building Node.js apps, is sending events that are happening inside the computer system, lower level, closer to the machine. However, we often get confused because, remember, the JavaScript code often wraps calls to the C++ side of Node. So oftentimes, when an event occurs in libuv, it generates a custom JavaScript event to make it easier for us to manage our code and decide what code should run when that event happens. So you can think of it sometimes as if it was just one thing, but it's not. As we're about to see, the JavaScript side is faking it. It's not real events. What do we mean by that? Well, JavaScript doesn't have an eventing concept. There's no event object in JavaScript. But we can fake it. We can create our own event library, our own way of creating, telling the code that something has happened and responding to that something happening with the technique that the Node event emitter uses. All right, so how can we understand first the JavaScript side? Because that's the side we're going to look at right now. Because that's the side that many core modules are actually built on top of. And then later we'll see how libuv helps us as well. But to understand the event emitter, to understand the trick that's being done The best way is to build our own. Now you might think, well, that sounds hard, but actually it's incredibly simple. And understanding that by building our own event emitter quickly will help us understand how we can use the Node event emitter and all of the core modules that are built on top of it. All right, let's move on.